guess that would help, wouldn't it? If I actually put my microphone on instead of in my shirt. We are continuing what we began looking at this morning, talking about boundaries within marriage and understanding these principles. Now, well, I'll just be honest with you. I sent a message to a group of friends that I have this afternoon, and just being honest, I told them, I said, I hate preaching on marriage. And it's not because the Bible isn't clear, because it is. But because marriage is idiosyncratic, it is peculiar, it is individual, it is two people and their personalities and their dynamics and the things that are going on. And every marriage represents every one of those things. How do you talk about a subject so... How do you talk in any way that can speak into every single situation? You can't. You can't qualify everything. You can't give all the caveats. If you did that, you'd spend your whole time giving caveats. You can't apply it to every single situation. And so it's a really, really frustrating type thing, at least for me anyway. And the other thing to remember is this, is that I have never met a person who does these things perfectly. The purpose for boundaries within a relationship are not so that we can stand up and say, hey, you know, Cloud and Townsend, they wrote this book and I follow it. Okay, great, but God also wrote a book, and that's probably a little more important. But the reason why we want boundaries in place, that we communicate what we need and we make sure that things are going well and that people feel safe, is because we need those boundaries in order to know that I can look at a situation and say, I crossed the line. And some people, because they do not live with any type of a boundary whatsoever, they bulldoze people. They walk and run flat over them because they don't understand how boundaries work. And so boundaries many times are there to give us the ideal of what we should strive for and to remind us and to show us when we've stepped over a line and how we can go about reconciliation. And so it's not the idea that anyone practices them with perfection. As a matter of fact, you want to feel the height of hypocrisy, stand up and talk about something that you've broken every law in half. Not a one that we've talked about, I can honestly tell you I've never broken. So, with that in mind, let's give it a shot again. So we talked about some of these boundaries, and we gave their definition and kind of qualified it a little bit, understanding that we have God-given boundaries. God draws certain lines and says these things can't be crossed, and so we're assuming that in our study. What we're kind of looking at is some of these personal guideline boundaries that God gives us, and He says, you know, we need to operate within the framework of these things. Exactly what that operation looks like, that's going to be up to the individual, really, and how their personalities work and the agreements they come to in their relationship with each other. And so then we spent the time looking at the first 5 of these laws, and so we'll pick up tonight looking at the last 5, all right? So the first one we want to pay attention to is the law of evaluation. The law of evaluation. In Ephesians 4 and verse 25, Paul said, let every man put away lying and let us speak the truth to one another because we are members of one another. Obviously in a context of speaking openly and honestly with one another. And so the basic idea of the law of evaluation is we need to communicate these boundary lines. We need to communicate, period. But we need to communicate boundary lines, and we need to evaluate the appropriateness of a boundary. Okay? So we need to communicate it. I'm not going to presume that you should know this. Okay? I'm going to actually tell you. And then we need to evaluate the lines that are drawn. Now, why do we do that? Well, I don't know about you, but as human beings, we have this tendency to go right and left. Right and left, right and left. And center is really hard for us. So, for an example, in Mark chapter 7, you remember they criticized the disciples of Jesus for not washing their hands before they eat. So what do? You see, the Pharisees, they constructed all these boundaries and laws and rules, but they were extreme in their application of them, right? Then you've got other people who look at it and say, oh, well, boundaries, they don't really exist. Like in Jude in verse 4, when people today say, well, God's grace will cover me, and they use that, and certainly God's grace will, but that's not a license to go live a life of sensuality and to do what you want to do, right? And so that's Jude 4. And so we have this tendency sometimes to set boundaries that are too loose and sometimes to set them that are too tight. And we need to understand and need to be open to reason that maybe what I'm expecting in this relationship may not be fair. Maybe what I'm expecting of my husband or my wife may be too stringent. I may be demanding something of them that's just unfair. And so I have to constantly be willing to look at and to evaluate these particular things and to go through them. So, now this is what makes it all the more complicated. How do you know if a boundary is too tough? Well, that's not always the easiest thing in the world to do, because sometimes what can happen is when you have a relationship where people have not lived with boundaries whatsoever, and then you begin to, and this is true in any relationship, when you begin to draw boundary lines and say, this isn't going to be acceptable anymore. Listen, for a long time you have allowed this person to continue in this behavior and you've never stopped it. What do you think is going to happen the first time you draw that line and say, nope, it's not going to happen this time? You're going to cry foul. Right? What do you mean? Why is this time different? Every other time you've allowed it. Okay? So just because someone doesn't like a boundary line doesn't necessarily mean it's too loose or too stringent. It just, it kind of complicates its implementation sometimes. But really the basic premise of is it too stringent or is it too loose is understanding the difference between pain and injury. Okay, pain and injury. There are a lot of things in life that are painful. But pain is and can be used in a good way. What are we doing when we discipline our kids? Whether we're spanking them, we're grounding them, whatever it is, what are you doing? You're trying to show them, you're trying to get them to associate the pain of punishment, consequences, with their actions, right? So, pain can be a good teacher. And so, a person may feel pain because we draw a line on something and say, no, that's not going to be acceptable. But that's very different than injuring someone, okay? Injuring someone or injuring a relationship. For an example, if let's say you've got a relationship where we're struggling financially, and it's like Nate Bargatze says, in every relationship, you've got two people, and they're both opposite. One's a dreamer, money's not real, let's just go have fun, okay? And you've got the other who's realistic, who says, I'd like to kill every ounce of fun you ever wanted to have. And they marry each other. And it's pretty much true. But you get one who's a little bit more of a free spender, and then they start chronically putting their family's financial future in danger. One of the things that may need to be done is one spouse may have to go to the other and say, okay, we're going to have to put limits on this. Cards that you have are going to have to be limited. Okay? This is not a permanent thing, but until we can kind of get ourselves under control, we're going to have to put restrictions on ourselves. Now, I don't know about you, but I would like to have enough money to do whatever I want to do all the time. And can it be painful, and will it be painful to the individual when they have to learn to live in those restricted areas of that money? Yes. But I can tell you one thing they won't be doing anymore. They won't be injuring the family. They won't be injuring the family's financial health. They won't be injuring the family's relationship. Okay? And so there's a difference. They may feel the pain of having to live on a stricter budget, but that pain is a good thing. What's not good is for them to never feel any pain and then the entire family have to be injured in the process. And so when we're dealing with evaluating them, we need to understand what is the difference between pain and injury. Okay? Number 2 is the law of proactivity. So this says that we have to take action to solve problems based on values, wants, and needs. Okay? Values, wants, and needs. And those 3 levels are important. Values. Many times, and by this we're talking about God values, God controlling and God honoring values. Wants. Okay? These are things I would like to see happen. And then needs. These are things that are necessary. So here are God's values, here are things that I need, and then here are things that I want. Now, what happens sometimes is when we get into a disagreement on something, we can't differentiate between the 3. Okay? Now, look, if we're talking about a God value, well, we're going to look at what God says and we're going to operate according to that value. If we're talking about needs, something that you need in order to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel honored, we're going to work at that. But what I want, now we're in an area of compromise. And what I want, and what my husband or my wife wants, now that's got to be negotiable. You have to come to a point where both people can walk away and feel like they've gotten something out of the deal. Okay? So, in essence, if we come to negotiation of wants and one person wins, what does it mean the other person does? They lose. Okay? We're not interested in winning, losing. We're interested in winning and winning. Okay? In a way that can honor that. So, we're going to go through and we're going to do those things. Now, let's think about then, based upon that, going through the process of what this looks like. So when we need to talk to our spouse about something that could be difficult, something that, okay, for lack of a better term, call it confrontation. Here are 2 extremes we need to avoid. One is, as a spouse, I need to be able, or my spouse should be able to talk to me, number 1, without the fear that I'm going to diminish or dismiss the way that they feel. And we do this. That's just not a big deal. Wait a minute now. It may not be a big deal to me, but I'm married, and if it's a big deal to my spouse, it is therefore then a big deal to me. I'm not going to dismiss it or diminish it. And so I have to know, my spouse has to know that they can talk to me about anything, and I'm not going to diminish them or dismiss them. The other side. When my spouse comes to talk to me about something, and especially something maybe I need to improve and work on, they need to know that they can talk to me and be open and honest about what needs to happen and what needs to change without me falling apart and claiming, well, you just don't love me. Listen, this is why marriage is for adults. It's not for children, where confrontation, any disagreement is taken personally at every level. That's not how this works. So we need to know that we can bring an issue without being diminished and dismissed and roll our eyes and say it's not a big deal, you just need to get over it. And we also need to understand that our spouse needs to feel free to come to us and them not have to tiptoe constantly around every single little feeling because, well, for lack of a better illustration, we're 5 years old and our feelings get hurt easy. Okay? We do have to have a level of maturity to talk straight with each other. Okay? So, in communicating that, there is, and so there are different levels of this, and again, this is why preaching on marriage is so frustrating, trying to explain it all and get it in its proper context. What I mean right here, I'm going to talk about being afraid of your spouse. What I do not mean by that, we're not talking about an abusive relationship where you're actually literally fearful of your spouse that they might hurt you. I'm talking that some people are afraid of their spouse to the point that they won't buck them and they won't challenge them on a single thing. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't understand that mentality. In marriage, your spouse is one of God's greatest gifts to you to help you improve. But you know, you're also supposed to help them. And there are a lot of people, there are a lot of husbands and wives who tiptoe around each other and they're afraid to bring something to the attention of the other. Now listen, when I say bring it to their attention, I'm not talking about you got to be a jerk and strut in there like a peacock. But you also can't be afraid to tell one another a truth that the other one needs to hear. My wife needs to know that she can come to me and say, hey, what you said in that sermon, you shouldn't have said that. And there are some people who have tried to get on to her for that before, to which I quickly remind them, no, you leave her alone. Because that's what I need, because there's nobody in the room that knows me better than her. And if I'm not accountable to anyone, that's dangerous. But we can't be afraid. Would I love to tell you that I always welcome and say, you know, I just love you so much and thank you for telling me? No. But we have to be able to at least put it on the radar of our spouse that says, you need to think about this. We can't be afraid. We've got to be willing to take that to them. Otherwise, it's going to end up diminishing the relationship. So, proactivity. Now, where is this fine line of being proactive? We're going to them and talking to them. Well, how long should you wait before you address an issue that you have with your spouse? Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that question. Well, you don't want to stew on it. You don't want to hold it in forever until it makes you bitter in the way that you view one another. But at the same time, we also need to take some time and do some self-evaluation and say, am I being a little ridiculous with this? Like, is this as big a deal as I'm making it in the moment? And so when should we bring it up? Well, I think when we've given it some time to try and think through it and we've calmed ourselves down a little bit. Either way, and not get swept up in the moment. But we're going to them and we're talking to them. And look, this is not just marriage, it's every relationship. Matthew 18:15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. How long is that process supposed to take? I don't know. But I would think it would need to take some time. So when we're dealing with proactivity, we've got to have maturity on both sides that can handle tough conversations, who can handle certain things with wisdom and can go through those things. And so just a zillion things that could be said there. We'll leave it there. Number 3, the law of envy. The law of envy. I loved this definition they gave in the book. They said, envy is devaluing what we have, thinking it's not enough. Devaluing what we have, thinking it's not enough. Now listen, there is a difference between envy and desire. Is it wrong for a person to look at their station in life, let's say financially, and to say, you know, I want to improve my financial situation? What's wrong with that? That's a desire, right? But that's not envy. What's wrong with looking at my marriage relationship and saying, I want to improve it? Nothing. But the law of envy says, you know what? I wonder what it would be like to be married to this person. Listen, the second we start thinking about that, we should be very, very, very afraid. And we should take some serious actions internally to address that. Because we get dissatisfied and then we start, instead of looking in and focusing on what we can control and focusing on growing our relationship, we start looking outside and we're looking for other people. And we start idealizing people. Listen, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. Whoever that person is that you think is God's gift to whatever, I can promise you 2 things about them. When they wake up in the morning, their breath stinks, and they go to the bathroom just like everybody else. The way you see them, when you idealize them, is not correct. They are flawed, and they are equally as flawed as your partner that you seem to be dissatisfied with. Be careful about even entertaining the thought of looking over your backyard into the backyard of another person. So, envy. You remember, what is the last of the 10 commandments? Exodus 20 and verse 17. You shall not covet or envy. You shall not covet what? Your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's wife, or your neighbor's servant, or your neighbor's animals. You shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. And so what it does is it takes us into the passive and takes us out into fields that lead to utter destruction. And I can promise you this. People say, what's the big deal? It's not like you're going to act on it. Well, okay. I'm sure there are plenty of people who've entertained it and never acted on it. I won't argue that point with you. But I can also guarantee you this. Every person who has ever acted on it, you know what they first did? They entertained it. They first entertained it. Number 4, the law of activity. We need to take initiative in solving our problems and in seeking to love our spouses. Look, we're going to make mistakes, okay? we have to learn to view, even when our spouse does something and they think they're helping us, and sometimes we need to understand when their heart and motive is in the right place, even if the execution may not be just perfect. The law of activity says, I'm going to seek to love you. I'm going to actively do things to demonstrate that I love you. So for an example, he may buy you some flowers, and you may think, these are the ugliest things I have ever laid my eyes on. Did he get them off of the side of the road? You know what? You can be that way. And you can be critical of him. Or you can look at him and say, you know what? He stopped and he thought of me. There was a lady in the ladies' Bible class I taught in my first job, and she was telling the story of her husband, and he had done the dishes to try and help her out, put them up and put them in the dishwasher, do all that kind of thing. She said, but when I got in there, the countertop was just covered in water. And you know, your first thought is, how do you not know the countertop is covered in water? And she said, but my husband did the dishes. I can wipe a countertop. He's trying. And many times what can happen is when we talk about marriage and how to improve it, one of the spouses, they work up their courage. And let me tell you something, sometimes you got to work it up. They work up the courage to step out, and the second they step out, we just smack them right back down. How could you think that would be? Listen. Then talk about the execution. But don't miss his heart. Don't miss her heart. The same, listen, and especially, I mean, I can't speak as a woman, obviously. I'm not one. I've never been one. I'll never be one. But I'm going to, look, men are nothing but little boys in big bodies. That's all we are. When we do something, when we pick a flower, when we're a young boy and we pick a flower for our mom and it's a weed, we want them to pat us on the back and tell us how pretty it is and whatever. Look, our taste may not improve the older we get, but our notion, our heart that says we want to tell you we love you, we're just not exactly sure how all the time, is still there. So the law of activity says, I'm willing to try, and you know what? I'm going to mess up. I'm not going to buy the right thing. I'm going to miss look, I'm going to try and do all this stuff, and it's going to fail. And you know what? At the beginning, especially as you're trying to figure it out, you're going to. But you're also going to learn. And you're going to get better. And so, having that activity and approaching it is important. Then finally, the law of exposure, which again is coming back to what we've hinted at and talked about several times, and that is you make your boundaries clear to each other. Exodus 20, when they entered into covenant with God, why did he give them the 10 Commandments? Here are the boundaries. You enter into a relationship with me, with Yahweh, the God of, soon to be the God of Israel. This is what we'll do. This is what is acceptable. This is what is not acceptable. And so a boundary has to be communicated. But how do we communicate them? I'll tell you that this is not the way. You don't walk up to somebody you love and tell them, look, this may have been okay before, but it stops today. Sometimes, it's amazing to me sometimes how we can be so confrontational to someone we love and we're married to. I mean, we're confronting them like there's some kind of a criminal on the outside of our home. Why can't we simply come to them and say, look, this is what's going on, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm processing. And when you do this, when we go through the process, we have to explain it, and I know men, we have to feel, which is kind of icky to us, but we have to explain it. Okay? Let me give you a classic husband and wife debate. And it feels like a lose-lose situation because no matter which way I tell it, if the husband says it or if the wife says it, somebody's going to be upset that I didn't do it the other way. So I guess I'll just take the cuts from both sides. I don't know. Husband comes in and says, whew, man, I am just tired. She said, tired? And it turns into a competition about who is the most tired. Maybe what the other person is saying is, I had a hard day. And when you come at me and you try and explain to me why I shouldn't be tired and you've done more than I have and therefore you're free and your tiredness far exceeds my tiredness, you're telling me my problems don't matter. You're telling me that the work that I do is not tiring. And to be honest with you, I don't appreciate that. I don't like the way that reflects on me. I don't like the way that makes me feel. I'm not trying to be in a competition with you. I'm not trying to work harder than you. I was trying to love you and just communicate with you. That's it. So we explain what's going on. That way then they can take it and understand it, hopefully. And we could come at different responses in ways that are not hostile and that don't make the... Surely we can learn to live together in a way that's fulfilling to both of us. Listen, if your goal is to win your marriage, I can promise you this, you're going to lose. If your goal is to win it, you'll lose it. But if your goal is to love the other person, it will be something special. So when we look at these laws and principles, and I've never been so happy to see a closing slide. When we practice them and we embody them, look, our divorce rates are astronomical, and people say, well, they're dropping. Well, look, numbers are numbers, okay? they're dropping because not as many people are getting married and they're living together and breaking up. And so the divorce, that's deceptive. You have to understand how to read the numbers on it. But and then the amount of ones who are staying married, and then the amount of ones who are staying married, but you ask that really pesky question that says, "Are you happy?" Oof. And if you're going to be in the relationship, why not be in one that's good? And what greater testament to people out in the world who are constantly cutting each other down as spouses and walking over each other and getting mad at each other and taking their problems and telling the world about all the flaws that their spouse has. What kind of a testimony to the world? And I'm not talking, well, I think you know me well enough to know I'm not talking about being superficial. Oh, our marriage is great and we're just floaty and I just love him and he's just, okay, I'll puke later, but because I don't believe you. That's ridiculous. That's not what we're talking about. But when people can look at us and see that we're actually not fighting each other, we're actually on each other's team. And we actually love each other. And you can call me whipped, you can call me feminine, you can call me whatever you want to. I'll call me happily married. And you can walk back into your war zone if you want to. But when people see that, it's a door open to the gospel. They see that relationships can live this way. And it not only speaks of our relationship with each other, it speaks of God's relationship with us and the freedom and the forgiveness and the love and the care and the support. And so it opens those doors. So maybe tonight someone wants to enter into that relationship with God with penitent faith, confessing Jesus to be baptized in water for the forgiveness of our sins. Maybe we're struggling, maybe whatever it is, we want to help each other. This is not the only time, it's certainly a time. And if we're struggling in general, and if we're struggling, and by the way, going to talk to someone about my marriage relationship, it does not mean that our marriage is bad because we go to a counselor. As a matter of fact, in my experience and in other people who have been in the same situation as I have trying to help people, one of them summed it up perfectly a few years ago when we were talking. He said, here's the thing. He said, most people wait too late. He said, if they had come to us, if we had gotten them earlier, we could have done something. But a lot of times when they come see us, it's just a formality. We could have helped them. I don't care who you see. Just get some help. See somebody. And improve. If we can help each other tonight, we want to. Let's stand and sing this song.